Hi, Ken 1171 here, and in this video, I'm going to show you a new script I have created for Poser 12 called the Unimesh Exporter. It kind of resolves a very old problem that Poser always had, which it creates a barrier when we want to export geometry for sculpting somewhere else, or, for example, to use as a morph target in the studio, for example, that requires Unimesh. Poser itself does not support Unimesh on the current version, and it never has until now. And the problem is, whenever we load a figure into Poser, it instantly splits the geometry, where each group becomes its own split geometry, meaning Poser doesn't know how to put it back together after this point. So the vertex order is not the same anymore. The vertex count is not the same anymore. So it becomes invalid as a morph target in programs that require Unimesh. And since the geometry is all split, if I try to sculpt on it in other software, for example, in Blender, if I load it here, uh, the moment I run, for example, smoothing brush over the scene between two groups, it may open a hole right there because these vertices are not welded. So as you can see, that's a problem. So that inspired me to create a new script called the Unimesh Exporter. Let's launch it here, and this is what it looks like. So what does it do? Well, it does what Poser could never do. It can export geometry without splitting every group into separate geometry. It exports a Unimesh um, geometry that matches the original from the geometries folder, the OBJ there in the geometries folder, something that Poser cannot do. So let's do a test here. Let's get, for example, the Morphing Tool, and let's create a new morph, and I'm going to call this a partial body morph horns. I'm going to create something very simple here. Just a couple of horns, like this. And then I'm going to mirror it to the other side. It's nothing fancy, just something to have a morph to work with. Okay, so that's what it do. I'm going to set limits to this, like 0 to 1. And I'm going to zero it. And the way that this script works is I have to initialize the figure first. And then this does like a dozen things. You can check the manual to see all that it does with the initialize figure button. And let's do that now. So it's took like a second to do it, and it's completed. Now I can dial my morph and click Export Unimesh Morph Target, which is going to export a Unimesh version of this geometry to file. Okay, so let's save it. I'm going to save this as my morph, or no, let's put it the same name, like partial body morph horns. We're going to call this the Poser version. And let's save it. And it does its thing. Have to wait a little bit, and it's done. Now I have an exported morph target. I can close the tool. I can zero this morph, and let's load this back and see what we get. I'm going to load a full body morph. And here it is, the Poser version that I just exported. I'm going to load it back. And it's going to show here. So this is the original morph, the one that I created in Poser, and this is the one I exported. As you can see, it works just the same. This is not quite a good example because Poser could export the broken geometry it creates because it knows how to import it, since the geometry that Poser has on the scene right now, it's split anyway. So it can import Unimesh, which is this one, or it could import split geometry just the same. So this doesn't do much good. That's not what I created this for. What I'm going to do is I'm going to load this geometry in Blender. So to do that, I have to go here to import wavefront, and I'm going to paste the folder. And here is the morph I want to import. I'm going to use a poser preset and import it. Just to show you what the settings are, you have to keep the vertex order and the polygroups. That's the only thing that matters. So let's import it. Here it is, the figure. And as you can see, it does have the horns. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a third one. I'm going to modify this morph target. So let's switch to edit mode. And let's go to the sculpting tools. Here it is. And I'm going to use the grab. This is the one. I'm going to grab a vertex from the center here. I'm going to pull like a third. It doesn't look very good. Let me try that again. Okay. It doesn't matter what it looks like. All I want is to create a modification here that I can load as a morph target. Okay, so let's export this change I did. Let's go back to File, Export, Wavefront. I'm going to export to the same place where the other OBJ is. And I'm going to use my poser preset, which is selection only and only these two here, polygroups and keep vertex order. I'm not keeping the UVs and materials because morph targets don't need those. So I'm going to call this, let's see, partial body morph, horns, blender. So we know where it came from. And then save it. All right. So what we're going to do now is, first, we're going to test this by loading it in Poser itself. Load full body morph. And let's get the Blender version. Let's take a look. As you can see, it has the third horn. It's working. But again, like I said, Poser could work with this whether it's split or not. That's not the challenge. So let's go to DAZ Studio where I have the same figure loaded, and we're going to load this morph, the Blender version, and it's in Poser scale. There you go. And let's go to parameters, morph, and here it is. I'm going to filter this by horn. And here is the morph. As you can see, this works in DAZ Studio, meaning the geometry that I exported from Poser and that I edited in Blender and then I loaded into DAZ Studio, it has to be Unimesh, or this, what you saw here, would not work. If I try to load a morph target exported from Poser itself, not the script, the figure would basically explode. Let's test this. I'm going to export, not using the script, but export from Poser itself. With this morph applied, let's get export to OBJ. The figure, I'm going to weld. That's the only two options that I need. And weld, include body groups, and that's it. Click OK. I'm going to save in the same folder as the others, but this one I'm going to call horns Poser 2 because it's coming from Poser. Okay. Takes a sec. Let's go back to the studio. Let's zero this morph and let's load the new one that I just created, which is called the Poser 2. This was exported from Poser, meaning it's not Unimesh. Let's load it. And let's take a look. It accepted because I welded, so it has the same number of vertices. But let's see what when I dial it, what happens. Yeah, the horror. Looks like a horror movie. Why is the figure exploding? That's the thing I said. Although it has this morph target has the same number of vertices as the other one, which matches the Unimesh version, what it doesn't have is the same vertex order, which means it completely invalidates the morph as a morph target. And that's what I wanted to show you. This tool can provide the kind of Unimesh workflow the Poser never had. Now you can export all morphs you do in Poser to sculpt in other places like I did in Blender. You can load it in that studio or any other software that requires Unimesh or Poser that doesn't, but it loads it anyway. And that's what I wanted to show you. You have options to export to the studio scale or Poser scale. And some other options I have here. I have added the reset translation and scale and a separate reset rotations, specifically for figures that have scale and translations embedded into the CR2. So when you reset the figure, it doesn't really reset it. It resets to whatever values that those rotations and scales or translations were set to, which doesn't really reset the figure. So you have an option here to keep them. You can check the manual, which you can open by clicking the question mark at any time. You can open the PDF manual. And I explained there, for example, the ohm, the male counterpart for La Femme. He has scales and translations embedded into the CR2. So that's not going to work as easily as you have seen here with Dawn. But I have provided instructions on the manual on how to handle figures like that. And that's where you use these options here. And that's what I wanted to show you. Thank you.